my round, Rosa. I won't forget. All right, we're now live. So hi, everyone, and welcome to what is the last lunch hour we're going to be doing until September. And this time, like so many other organisations, we're reflecting on the first year of Keir Starmer's Labour government. As ever, it's going to be a sort of very informal conversation, and do stick your questions in Slido. And I know I keep saying this, but I will try and be better about putting your questions to the panelists, and I won't ignore as many of them as I usually do. But let's start just with a sort of easy one, and I'm going to go to you first, John, if that's all right. And just so you know, what are your overall reflections on this first year of the Starmer government?
Well, I suppose the top line for me, in the first 10 months of this Labour government, real wages rose by more than in the last 10 years of the previous Tory government. So materially, a better world to live in. And if that carries on for a full parliamentary term, that delivers something of substance. But in core, you know, what we've seen, industrial strategy come out, £100 billion of investment in infrastructure planned, announced in the last couple of weeks, £40 billion extra in public services, pay deals, pay disputes settled in for teachers, for nurses, for doctors. We've got renters' rights, we've got the nationalisation of the railways, we've got Great British Energy, we've got the decarbonisation of the electricity networks, we've got all kinds of progressive things going on, 4 million appointments in the NHS, waiting lists falling, everything going well for a year, first year in progress, and internationally a good relationship with the new president in America, President Trump, 3 trade deals, India, difficult one, US, difficult one, European Union reset, defense and security, Labour at the heart of NATO, Labour government at the heart, all kinds of things that are going on. We tell a great story about a Labour government's first year, and a year bookended by failed attempts to take money out of Social Security by cutting benefits. And that's what dominates people's thinking about it. You know, July last year, winter fuel payments are cut now reversed. And just this last month, cuts disability benefits, cuts which have been reversed as well. So if Labour had in July last year decided not to touch Social Security, we'd be talking about a very, very successful year of progress in very challenging circumstances.
Your glass is basically full. It's not even half full.
My glass is overfull,
Overflowing.
Spilling on the table in front of me.
Jill, your thoughts?
Well, it's quite interesting that not even Keir Starmer particularly agrees with John, since he's spent the last 10 days apologising for various mistakes. So I think first thing that actually what John shows is quite how poor the communications operation in Number 10 is, because John, I think, has done a rather better job at putting the government's case than the government has been managing to do. And I think that's one of the really interesting characterisations. Those of us who were there in 97 remember that actually they may have been a bit frustrated about some things they could do straight away, but the bit that they undoubtedly had was a very, very, very effective, if slightly bullying comms operation, and no one was in doubt of that. And I think that's been one of the oddest oversights. Where John, I think, is right is that the government actually, we've been sort of all distracted by the clear dysfunction inside Downing Street. And I think there is dysfunction inside Downing Street. I don't think Keir Starmer's yet cracked how to run the centre of government, how to run Downing Street. But that has to an extent overshadowed a lot of activity in departments. I mean, just the sheer weight of documents published in the last month has been quite overwhelming. I mean, a massive industrial strategy, 168-page plan for health, etc., etc., etc. But where I think, you know, John needs to be hoping is that this, over the next 3-4 years, really starts to turn into tangible changes that people then give the government credit for. And I think those are two slightly separate things, because people are very ready to blame the government for everything that goes wrong, even if it's not very much to do with the government. But equally, there are lots of other people who'll be stepping up to take credit. I'll give you an example. I was talking to a friend last week who said his local bellwether is his butcher, who is, I think, a reform councillor, or at least a reform supporter. That councillor's gone to reform. Potholes have been filled recently. The reform councillor is saying, look what a difference reform makes. You do something, instantly your potholes are filled. It's nothing to do with local councillors. Labour's put aside money to do that. So I think the government does need to be connecting what it's doing to people's experiences, and those need to be sustained. But first of all, they have some really challenging times to get through. It's fine for John to say that they've seen off an attempt to take away a winter fuel allowance. They've seen off disability cuts, but we all know that that means that Rachel Reeves, who we assume now is more impregnable as Chancellor than she was before last week, thanks to the bond markets, that Rachel Reeves has a very, very difficult budget to navigate. And at the moment, it looks like the Labour story is going to be punctuated by loads of really, really difficult fiscal events whenever the numbers come back and hit her in the face, until some of these things really do translate into some growth on the ground.
Thanks, Jill. Rosa, let me just say firstly, Rosa Prince isn't Kate Devlin, who was poorly. Rosa has very, very kindly stepped in, columnist at Bloomberg at the last minute, for which we are eternally grateful. Rosa.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I think Jill's right. If you ask the question to Keir Starmer, what's his first year been like? I don't think he would be all that happy about the way it's gone. Certainly last week, the week of the anniversary on Friday, was his worst week in office, the government's worst week in office. And there have been some successes. I think it's been a surprise how comfortable he has felt on the international arena, and perhaps we can talk about that, particularly his handling of Donald Trump. But domestically, the year was bookended by those two big mistakes: the error in trying to take away winter fuel, which they U-turned on, and the error in trying to reform PIPs, which they U-turned on. And the problem there is not so much the policy. I mean, John has a view on whether it's right or not. My sense is more about the politics of it. If you're going to do it, you've got to do it. You can't just sort of exhaust all your political capital by saying you're going to do it and then prove unable to get it through the House of Commons, even though you've got this giant majority, because your MPs won't allow you to. So I think where we end up is that you've really got a Prime Minister and a government that's lost control of the agenda. And as Jill says, it's heading towards a very difficult budget coming up in the autumn, a big black hole in the public finances, and no real sense of where, how that's going to be filled. I've just come out of lobby this morning, lots of questions to the number 10 spokesperson about, will there be wealth taxes? No answers coming. Will they freeze income tax threshold again? There's still no answers, and those questions are going to come around and around until the budget. I think at root, look, Keir Starmer and the government, they inherited a real mess. I don't think anyone, he was very unlucky in that respect, that he came in after a Conservative government which had been pretty disastrous, with still tailwinds from those big shocks from COVID and from Ukraine. And he also was unlucky enough to be coming in when Donald Trump was about to come in, with the impact that we've had from tariffs on the economy, really stifling growth. But there have been those own goals. And I think part of the reason for that is that Keir Starmer likes to talk about not being ideological. Rachel Reeves is kind of similar. And they've just proved so bad at the politics. Anyone in and around Westminster could have told them for months that they would have an issue with these disability reforms that they were proposing, and they just kind of didn't listen. So I think they need to get much more political, and I would agree with Jill that also the communication is well off. So I think Bridget Phillipson and Johnny Reynolds gave them a 7 out of 10. I think I'd probably be a bit more 5 or 6.
Okay, thanks, Rosa. We'll come back to that whole thing about the relationship between the government and the parliamentary party, because I think that's quite important. But last but not least, Luke.
Thank you. So it's a mixed bag, but I think in terms of how the public have perceived the government, I suspect number 10 will be disappointed with the public reception they've had this year. And I think the key thing to say is it's not because they haven't done any popular policies, as we've talked about. In fact, lots of the individual policies that they've announced are very popular with the public. So the rise in the minimum wage, very popular, workers' rights, renters' rights, in fact, lots of things coming from the DPM's department, very popular, sewage, Great British Energy, a whole series of things, but they have been drowned out by a series of less popular policies, which have cut through much more and have come to define the government, as others have talked about. So the thing with the winter fuel allowance, it was almost on every level a mistake. It was announced into a vacuum. It wasn't in the manifesto. It was seen to be targeting, fairly or not, but this is how the public took it, groups that were perceived to be vulnerable and needed the money. And it just made people sort of think from the outset, this isn't why we elected a Labour government. We elected a Labour government to sort of bring an end to this stuff. And similarly with disability benefit cuts. And I slightly wonder if a bit of the mistake is that they took too much polling at the top line, which is if you ask people, should winter fuel be means tested? People say yes. They don't think millionaires should get it, but they also don't think the threshold should be 12 grand. If you ask people, should benefits broadly be reined in? People say yes, but they don't believe in doing it off the person that they know who is on PIP, who needs the funding. And I wonder if there was a bit of that. But taking a step back, I think the broader challenge, and almost I think that the mistake this government made before coming into office was the commitment not to reverse the Sunak-Hunt national insurance cuts. Because what that has meant is, rather than doing a kind of broad-based tax rise, which sort of, diffuses the pain, let's remember, no one noticed those Hunt-Sunak cuts anyway, they've had to target individual groups. And one of the things that we hear a lot in focus groups is, why are they going after the elderly, the disabled, and farmers, people who that they think can't fight back, or small businesses with the employers' nicks? I think they would have been far better if they'd just been able to use the money from reversing those NICs cuts. And I think, the reason I bring that up, it's not to get in the weeds, but I think it's defined the whole of the first year, that fiscal straitjacket that they put themselves in led to some of these unpopular decisions. But, when you chat to people who voted Labour, most of them say, I'm a bit disappointed, but I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm willing to give them a bit more time. The one thing that they must hit on the head, though, is the perception of chaos, because that is what has come out of the past 2 weeks. It's around 7 in 10 now say the government's chaotic, and as chaotic as the last government. And we know one of the reasons people booted the Tories out with such force was they were fed up of political drama. They just want to be able to turn off the TV. They want that politics that treads a little lightly on their lives.
Yeah,
Starmer talked about, and that's, for me, is the biggest risk to them at the moment.
Okay, I want to come back later on, Luke, and talk a little bit about the MRP that you've just released, which is really, really interesting. But let's start with the specifics of the government's off-stated first priority, which is growth. And I'll start with you, Jill, as a former Treasury official here, if I may. Have you heard or seen anything that makes you confident that they're going to achieve that kind of growth? Do you think they've got? I mean, they've been criticised quite a lot by people from Ben Ansell to Paul Johnson have written things about the lack of a theory of growth. Do you see a plan here that convinces you?
So, I mean, plan for growth. I'm not sure you can have a totally convincing plan for growth. I mean, I think the problem going into the election was that when you heard Labour MPs being asked, how are you going to deliver growth? What they then said was, last time we were in government, growth was 2.5% per annum under New Labour. And it was almost as though they thought there was a direct causality rather than correlation, that simply the fact of having a Labour government would automatically lift us out of the growth doldrums and suddenly we'd get an extra 2% growth a year and everything be hunky-dory and they could avoid all those spending choices. By the way, I absolutely agree with Luke that I think Jeremy Hunt doesn't get nearly enough grief for his sheer fiscal irresponsibility of those NIC cuts going into the election, which were a desperate attempt to win the election, completely failed as a political strategy, but also seriously undermine the public finances. So I think Luke is absolutely right to look at that. I think the government's doing some of the things that are right. I mean, there was a big exercise by Resolution Foundation. Their then Chief Executive, Torsten Bell, is now a Treasury and Pensions Minister, about highlighting the lack of investment as a huge, big thing. And one of the things Rachel Reeves has done is managed to secure much more for public investment through quite sensible changes to fiscal rules that she introduced, not the ones we all focus on, which is this headroom on day-to-day spending, but the public investment one. They put in place some of the building blocks, if they can see them through and really stick them through, on planning, which even the OBR has allowed them to score. I think the government now acknowledges that those good things were slightly undermined by the Prime Minister's Rose Garden gloom fest in August, that sort of reset when he told us that things were all terrible. And then by the contortions they went through to find something you could dress up as not a tax rise on working people, which meant they selected about the worst tax for business confidence to go for in terms of going for that employment NICs increase. So I think it's been a bit of an offsetting thing. We now have this massive industrial strategy. My colleague Giles Wilkes, who writes for Institute for Government on industrial strategy, would say, well, actually, there isn't particularly a clear link between having an industrial strategy and growth. You can't sort of say, oh, we've now got 500 pages of industrial strategy, that's worth 0.5 on the growth rate or whatever. But it does seem to be quite responsive. They do seem to want to establish partnerships. They have identified a quite sensible selection of sectors that they want to focus on. But there are other sort of constraints, like, the migration constraint can constrain growth. So I think they're edging their way towards that. But the big joker in the pact as well is, and what's led to all the downgrading of the growth forecasts, is the sort of, bizarre approach to economic management being taken in the States. So, for every good bit the government has done that might add small percentage points to the growth rate, President Trump then comes and says, well, I'll see you that and I'll just do this and knock a bit off that growth rate. So I think they're going to have to reconcile themselves to the fact that a lot of this is out of their hands. But we'll have to see, and we'll have to see where Rachel Reeves goes in her budget. The one thing I find a bit disheartening about Rachel Reeves is I think she's not really a bold reformer. And if you're going to have somebody who prides themselves on being a professional economist as Chancellor, who makes quite sensible decisions like, let's not, have lots of fiscal events sprouting all over the year, let's do this sensibly, it would be very good if she was willing to look at the tax system as part of the growth story and do some serious tax reform. My line about Rachel Reeves, which looks a bit sort of odder after last week, is she's going to be unpopular anyway. It's a very difficult position. She's not got loads of cash to hand out like Gordon Brown had. She made some, but she's going to have a difficult time through the rest of the Parliament. So be unpopular, but leave a legacy that people can point to, is actually she's left us with a tax system that really is much more efficient and fairer. A much better tax system, even if it meant taking some unpopular decisions. Whether she can get that through the parliamentary party is now a separate issue, and one that the government needs to really turn its attention to, because otherwise it's just going to be knocked all over the place if it basically can do nothing with that size majority that takes anything away from any existing entitlement, because it's going to have to do a bit of that.
I mean, I wouldn't hold your breath on tax reform under any government, to be perfectly honest, however overdue.
Nor would I, but I am hoping, Anand, and someone needs to, I need to make the case for it as being a good thing to do, because otherwise all we do is get stuck in a terrible, dysfunctional tax system that actually undermines growth. They're willing to take on some things. They're taking on planning. It's not clear to me that tax reform is harder than that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And with every passing government, there are greater gains to be had from rationalising the tax system. But for some reason it's not something governments to do. I mean, Rosa, I'll sort of throw the same question to you about growth, but add to it the sort of supplementary, which is, I suppose, how worried should we be about the labour market figures and the noises from people like the Bank of England that seem to imply that the next rise is having an impact, and that if there is the possibility of unemployment becoming a new problem that we have to start worrying about.
Although there are also some figures today showing that business confidence in the UK is top of the tree. So another mixed picture. On growth, I think an aspect that's really interesting is the extent to which at the beginning, Rachel Reeves, she sort of did what the Treasury wanted her to do. She pulled the levers and put the investment into the parts of the country that she thought would have the most output in terms of achieving growth. So we had the Oxfam corridor, for example, the expansion of Heathrow, and then actually Labour MPs were quite upset about this and sort of said, with a levelling up, did it really have to die with the Tory government? And I did notice in the spending review that and in the infrastructure plan that a lot of those that newer projects were based in the other parts of the country, particularly in the north. And I wonder if that's something that they should sort of focus on more going forward, and also on skills. There's no point having all these nuclear power plants if they're all built by, well, there is a point, but there's less of a point if they're all built by the French, for example. So I wonder if they can get something going on that front. So yeah, I think growth is sort of the dog that didn't bark. It was all going to be about growth, and then there were these missteps, particularly on national insurance, that inhibited that. But it just makes another reason why that budget is so challenging, and just the black hole, really impossible to see where she goes other than tax rises. Yeah,
I will come to you in a sec, John, but first, Luke, what do the public think about the government's economic policies?
Yeah, so I think, obviously, growth is important, not least on delivering on lots of the things that the public want the government to deliver. I think they lean too hard into growth as the top priority rather than talking about living standards, because that's what people really think and care about. And in fact, if you poll the public, a big chunk of the public say that, when the economy grows, it is of no benefit to people like me. And I think it's around half of Reform voters think that. So I think the focus on growth doesn't really connect. And the thing that we hear, and I think this is part of the frustration at the government, is despite the fact, as John rightly says, there's been that big rise in real wages, people are still feeling the after effects of the big inflation we saw a couple of years ago. And there was a great piece on X with someone saying that, we measure inflation in 1 year cycles. Actually, the public think about it over a wider horizon, and they still haven't adjusted to higher price rises. And I remember we spoke to people in Runcorn the day after the by-election to try and find out, why they had gone from Labour to Reform. And, obviously winter fuel came up a lot, the freebie stuff, some of the other early missteps. But the mood was summed up by one woman who said, she was like, I'm in my late 50s now. I thought I'd be slowing down. In fact, I'm still doing shift work. And I feel like I'm not living, I'm just surviving at the moment. And that sentiment is one we pick up repeatedly. Again, someone in Coventry recently who said, I can't even afford to get the occasional fish and chips anymore. There's this sense that the sort of fund's been sucked out. And Labour, fairly or not, I think have been a little bit penalised for not being seen to do enough about that sort of quickly enough.
I think that point about how people perceive stuff is so important, particularly inflation. And I remember after Rishi Sunak promised to halve inflation, the number of people who told me that prices were going to come down. You need to be very careful with that messaging. So, John, glass half full.
So, look, there's something inherent in progressive politics, which is that Social Democrats seem to need to be miserabilists, to say how awful the world is. And that's why you need a progressive government to improve it with impactful policies. And the thing is, when you're miserable, you make other people miserable too. And there's something about the whole tone of the government, which is run down the world. Britain isn't broken. Like, it literally isn't broken. And most of the people who are in Luke's focus groups are fueling headlines in newspapers and repeating them back to each other. There's an internal negative cycle. And this government has a mood about it, which is not just is basically they came into office with their motto was basically what my old school motto was, which it wasn't me. It wasn't me. I didn't do this. I'm not responsible. And the most disempowering thing any government can do is say, I can't do this. Rachel, when she brought in the winter fuel payments cut, she went, I don't want to be doing this. Now, in your second or third week of government, the obvious riposte is you don't need to. You are literally the government. You are the one group of people in the country who don't need to be made to do anything. And that disempowering, I'm a victim, I can't help it. That has been a really profound part of the negative psychology, which does impact on growth, impacts on expectations, all these things. If it was a government that truly believed in growth, truly thought that growth was the North Star, the pole, everything we're going to move towards, we'd be rejoining the European Union. We'd be making that argument to rejoin a big open market of sales of goods and trade, but we're not doing that. Why not? Because we're scared by people. The government's scared of Luke and his focus groups. And there's an intense little knot, isn't there, of opinion pollsters, focus group holders, all these pollsters feeding into the media, who then have stories which then are read by number 10. It's like looking at the world and not trying to change the world. And I think this is the big issue about growth. The manifesto was a really bold manifesto. It said, we'll take on a big issue, decarbonizing the economy, a big issue, the transition, the green transition, a big issue. We're going to take on planning and infrastructure reform. It's taking those things on. It's actually making some unpopular policies, decisions, or tough ones early. And it's not talking the story of we're taking tough choices. We're doing big things. Only the OBR, me, Jill, and Matt Pennycook recognise that £3.7 billion of headroom was created by government planning deregulation. And why can't you do more of those things? Why is there no number to £100 billion of infrastructure investment will produce this much? There's something about the government that lacks swagger. It's got this miserablest approach, and that engulfs everything. So there's something about the growth thing. If you want growth, you need to be happy to get growth.
Excellent.
Can I just come
Luke.
back, Anand?
No, I think we're just going to blame you, Luke.
No. Because this is a sort of common thing. I mean, the pollsters and the focus groupers are doing it. If look at John's point about green transition, if you look at the polling on green transition, it's very popular, and we keep saying that to the council. I mean, focus groups, people talk about good jobs. If you look at EU relations, the polling and the focus groups, people show we want a closer relationship with Europe on planning as well. I mean, it slightly annoyed me when Kemi Badenoch.
I blame the government.
But Kemi Badenoch said it when she came to power. It's too much listening to focus groups. Well, if the last Tory government had been listening more to the focus groups, I don't think they'd have got into the mess they did. So, yeah, sorry, I'm slightly touchy about that one.
I'm still sticking to my blame Luke hashtag. I'm sorry, that's now a thing. When we will come back to the Brexit question, but actually, I mean, it's slightly odd, isn't it? Because the priority of the public over the last few months is one that we haven't touched on yet, which is, of course, immigration again. Immigration has risen to the top of the tree in terms of the sort of Ipsos salience tracker. And I wanted to have a quick word about what the government has done and what we think they might be able to do, both about the visa route and about irregular immigration. I'm going to start with you again, Jill, if that's all right, partly because you're at the top of my screen. Okay.
And is there a question there, Anand?
Yeah, what do you make of what the government has done so far? What do you make of their chances of, well, not just smashing the gangs, but reducing the number of small boats crossings? Does their immigration policy make any sense? Any or all of those? And the ones that are left over, I'll share out amongst the others.
Okay, well, on small boats, they will wait to see whether they get it up this week, and I think they'll be hoping they're doing stuff. I've had Yvette Cooper at the weekend, being very pleased to see the French police vandalising small boats and able to wade in the water to do it. They've been very unlucky with the weather, which is basically the lead sort of thing for two people come across. Remember, before small boats, we used to get people coming across in lorries, and then we had better controls. Maybe the SBS agreement will move people back into lorries, and we won't see so many small boats, which is a much worse way of coming across the channel. So I think, the interesting counterfactual that we will get from the Conservatives is, if only we'd had the Rwanda scheme, that would have deterred all these things. And it's because you cancel the Rwanda scheme without giving it a try. Notably, the Conservatives didn't think it was so much of a sure bet election winner that they decided to give it a couple of months before they went to the polls. But the Conservatives and Reform will throw that back. You lack a deterrent, you lack doing this, you lack. And they will probably also point to the fact that President Trump is doing stuff on the southern border, which is very different to our apparent ineffectuality there. On visa routes, they still seem to be of the view. It's very interesting because I think there's sort of a couple of sort of conflicting pressures here. They're trying to rein back on numbers because they feel that they desperately have to show much lower headline numbers, but they're already riding the wave of the changes that Rishi Sunak and James Cleverly brought in, and that's what's contributed to quite a big reduction in numbers so far. I think it'd be very interesting if they can do things on things like the social care visa, so you can stop it being a route to out and out abuse. That'd be better for social care workers, better for the social care sector, which they're otherwise not doing very much for. I think they're making I don't understand quite, maybe John or Luke can explain why they think making it take much longer to become a citizen, other than just as a revenue raiser for the Home Office, is a good thing. It seems to me that if people are coming here, you ideally want them to feel much more integrated and make that a positive thing. And I think citizenship ceremonies are really quite nice. I think they're quite moving events, actually, to see people who've chosen to come here and become Brits by choice. So I think they're a bit all over the place. And again, this is one of the places where I think they're driven by and chased. I don't think they necessarily have a clear view themselves on what they want. I think there's another place where they're driven by a combination of focus groups and trying to think ahead to where Reform will be, and the Conservatives to a lesser extent will be attacking them, and how can they move to head that criticism off. So I think we're in a bit of a mishmash. I think one of the disappointing things is that they haven't been bold and ambitious on what I call my Homes for Americans scheme, which is where you would actually be very actively going out and saying, we have a global talent visa. I think we have tending towards zero applications for global talent visas, but really trying to market the UK as a great place to come if you want to do serious scientific research and things like that, the sort of stuff that the Trump government wants to drive out of America. And I think it's a real shame that we're not jumping on that bandwagon with a bit more alacrity.
Rosa, does it make sense to you?
Yeah, I think the next big debate kind of coming down the track is going to be on the ECHR. It's gone a bit quiet, but it's definitely being talked about in government. And they are going to have to take a decision. Are they going to go full reform? Because presumably the Tories are going to call for it when they have their review finishing up nearer to their conference. Or are they going to try and do something else that somehow cuts through with the public? Because, as you say, it's risen up the agenda again and it's fueling reform. Now, we heard Shabana Mahmood a couple of weeks ago talking about reforming the court, but I don't know quite what that means. How do you reform it? It's not sort of, it's an easy thing to say, but nobody's saying what practically that means, other than perhaps disapplying it from foreigners, which I think a lot of Labour people will be quite queasy about if you're not, if you're stripping refugees who arrive here of human rights. So I think that is a problem for them. In terms of back to a question of what they're doing, I wonder about the other thing that's gone a bit quiet, but I think is really interesting, is the youth mobility scheme. At the beginning of the year, we were told, no way, never going to happen. And then when they did the trade deal, it actually got it was much further down the track towards it than I expected them to. And I think that they were happy with how it went. There didn't seem to be a big, upsurge of outrage from voters. Luke probably know more than me about that, but it felt like it landed okay. I think that the public really hate the sight of small boat arrivals. That when they talk about immigration, that's the image they have in their mind. I think that they're all comfortable with having their kids go work in Spain for 6 months, a Spanish teenager come here and work in a restaurant for 6 months, and hopefully that might deliver some of this growth that we're after as well. Get our restaurants and farms back on track. Yeah, so I think we should go for it.
I suppose that opens a lot of questions for you, Luke. I mean, partly the first one that came to my mind is, are they as happy to see an Indian come here and work as they are a Spaniard? I mean, is there a divide along those lines? And secondly, is it really the small boats that is driving this?
Yeah, we'll go to the first one. The defining issue for most people when it comes to immigration is channel crossings, as Rosa said, and building on what Jill said as well. It's because it is so visual for people. The channel occupies an important place in the British psyche, but also, we've talked about this before, but Brits hold one thing dear. It is a sense that you have to follow the rules. And one of the reasons they don't like channel crossings is they're seen as chaotic. We're not in control. To go to that point about agency and John's point about, I totally agree with, people expect the government to be in control. And on this, it looks like they're not. So all of that. And we actually asked, what is the bigger priority? Is it overall levels of immigration or is it channel crossings? And it was 74-14 in favour of crossings there. Now, that's not to say that people don't think the overall numbers too big. They do. But when you ask about specific types of workers, as we've discussed with Rob before, they are much more likely to say they want them to stay the same. And on the mobility schemes, agree with Rutter. The polling shows the public back that. One of the things we tested was, did they, because someone said to me, but the polling, people don't realise it's all of EU countries. They're just thinking of France and Spain, like you said. But we actually tested, this would mean people from Romania versus France, and people were a bit less supportive, but still on net supportive of an EU-wide scheme there. I think once you get further from Europe, you get a bit more resistance from people, but not when it comes to filling high-skilled jobs.
Yeah, we will come back to the Brexit question. We should remind ourselves we don't have a youth mobility scheme or a youth experience scheme yet. Actually, the biggest single question for me is how the EU could have had a mandate for 3 weeks and no one's leaked it. But anyway, John, your thoughts on immigration?
So look, I think politics is a Maslowian hierarchy, and the base of it, of everything in politics, is you've got to provide security. That can be economic security, environmental security, cyber security, national security, but fundamentally border security. A government that cannot provide border security doesn't pass the test of having anything else it talks about listened to. That's absolutely true. And I think Luke was right to focus on the word control. The most important thing about the phrase take back control was control. It's not stop it, it's control it. And the thing about small boat crossings is they are visibly, physically uncontrolled. Now, it is a mystery to me as to why people smugglers didn't use the boats before, because the 18th century shows you that Britain is full of small coastal beaches where you can smuggle into. So people smuggling is just a long line of UK smuggling history. And what you have to do, and with all these kinds of things, but criminal gangs, you need to treat them like the IRA, which you need to find informers, you need to use intelligence, you need to infiltrate, you need to do the whole thing of a comprehensive suppression in breaking a gang. And I think that's the thing that Keir is probably well suited to, probably Yvette Cooper's well suited to. It's not a thing you can particularly narrate. You can't say, well, the number of spies we've got inside the people smuggling gangs has increased by 10% in the last year. There's got to be something big and visible about stopping it. But I think there's for me, a bigger issue, which is I do think the government is mentally entered a very dangerous and untrue view of Britain and migration. I thought the Island of Strangers speech was an emblem of a government that's decided that immigration into Britain is an unfortunate experiment that failed. Yeah. And it doesn't matter whether you came from a country like Jamaica, where Britain was the mother country, where you're part of the realm, or whether you came through the European Union or what. It doesn't matter, because there's in the minds of the Labour Party a completely uneconomic model of the labour market, which is there's some employers who are holding down the prices of wages because they can get cheaper foreign labor to do wages that honest Brits won't do. And they also think there's a bunch of honest Brits who are slightly not honest, who are claiming disability benefits, who should be forced into the labour market to do the jobs that these foreigners are doing. And social care is one that Jill touched on it. The government's got an obsession with the fact that social care is an industry which holds down wages and gets foreign labour to allow that to happen. It's nonsense because the wages in social care are set by the government. More than half the places are bought by government, by local government, at a price set by central government. So the wages are set in local government prices are set by the government's settlement with them. So the government is chasing a problem that's not there, and it's part of a whole thing for me across the whole government. That whenever I hear the word reform from government, I kind of worry. The reform for this government at the moment is a solution in search of a problem. And there is a problem in migration. It is irregular migration, it's small boats. And you have to have quite brutal policing, visibly like the French are now trying to do, combined with very, very sophisticated intelligence-led operations. And there's a reason why there's a surplus of people coming, and that is because the Middle East is a chaos caused by the West. Caused by most of the people who come to our country, the UK, come because of geopolitical conflict, which takes us to another topic I'm sure we're going to touch on, which is what's the UK government doing in geopolitics. But you can't deal with one issue in isolation. And for me, this government is often trying to deal with one symptom and not deal with the system.
That's such a good segue that next time you can chair this discussion. Because I did want to come on to geopolitics and foreign policy. I want to talk a bit about foreign policy and Brexit, and I want to spare some time at the end to talk just a little bit about Labour MPs and also about the polling more generally. But on foreign policy, I mean, my impression is that Keir Starmer's played a very dodgy hand pretty well, to be honest, when it comes to sort of difficult decisions around Trump, reconciling that with relations with the EU, reconciling that with being the only country, well, certainly the odd man out amongst the EU and the US about not having tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. There's a real, I get mixed up between plate spinning and juggling, but it's one or the other, or maybe it's both. And my sense today is he's done this all right. I mean, there are dangers to come. Rosa, I was just wondering, what do you make of the early stages of this government's foreign policy?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. And like I said, it's been unexpected that he's found his happy place on the international stage. I think we all thought that he would be definitely not comfortable with Trump. There was a lot of talk, particularly in the early days, about whether or not he should stand up to Trump more and challenge him. And those calls got louder after the Canadian and Australian elections. But the difference was that Labour is not fighting an election at the moment. So that might have worked very well for Canada and Australian Labour parties to, or their equivalents, the Liberal Party to go for it. But here it just wasn't the wise thing to do. And there was frustration, I think, from Labour MPs in that group of people who thought he should stand up. It's not all been, plain sailing over Gaza. I think it's been a very tricky path to walk. In the beginning, even before the election, he had that disastrous LBC interview where he offended a lot of Labour members, led to lots of councillors defecting. I mean, directly, you could probably link it directly to the 5 independent MPs who were elected ahead of Labour candidates at the election. And since then, it's been a bit of a tightrope and consideration how much to condemn Israel. They seem to sort of recalibrate slightly a couple of weeks ago and feel that they could be a bit tougher and seem to have got away with that. The Americans seemed relaxed about it. Iran, again, was a tricky one. They kind of wanted to not say it was illegal, but the advice probably was that it was illegal, and they managed to kind of get away with that one by keeping their heads down. So, and then we have the EU reset, which I think could have gone a lot worse. It's not particularly full voted. It's not anything approaching renegotiating Brexit or even a comprehensive trade deal. But I think it's baby steps, and absolutely the mood music between London and Brussels is just completely transformed. We've got the state visits beginning tomorrow of President Macron, which will be, that just hadn't happened for so long because Conservative prime ministers couldn't possibly host a French president given their history. So and more broadly, interesting stuff going on elsewhere in the world. They're trying to shore up AUKUS, keep the Japanese on board, talking to Latin America. So I think actually, quietly they've kind of got on with it, and he's become, particularly as the world has become a more chaotic place, and you have populists forging ahead and lots of problems, he's sort of become a figure of substance, somebody people can turn to in a time of world crisis.
Jill, I think we've decided that President Macron is probably friend rather than foe under this government. And feel free to chip in on the broader foreign policy if you want. But what on the reset specifically, we don't call it a reset anymore. What used to be the reset? What have you made of it?
So it's a sort of builds on the dynamic started under Rishi Sunak. If you think that Boris Johnson, David Frost, Liz Truss plunged the relationship to a very, very low point of lack of trust, still managed to cooperate on Ukraine and sanctions to some extent, but everything else, the relationship was in the deep freeze. Starmer's clearly put a bit of momentum. He seems to be quite good, and this is the bit that I'm slightly surprised by, simply because he comes across as quite sort of aloof character. He does seem to be quite good at building personal relations with lots of leaders, quite different leaders. When you see him hanging out with Giorgia Meloni and things like that, it's not a natural person. You'd have thought, oh yeah, they're going to get on well or whatever. So I think that's gone quite well. I mean, I wouldn't oversell the reset so far. The statement on the 19th of May, the common understanding, had some words on defence, which are happening. But the big prize there for him is access to the defence procurement. That's not agreed yet, may never be agreed, ? They haven't landed the SBS deal yet. We know there's a nightmare of detail to go through as we ask for a few exemptions, and we work out what exactly decision shaping looks like. We haven't begun to negotiate the youth mobility agreement to see whether there is a landing zone. We were rebuffed with sort of language on quite a lot of our creative artists. Well, what's that? We'll support the creative sector. Well, that's nothing, burger. Mutual recognition, professional qualifications, we get a dedicated dialogue. We had that already. So I wouldn't oversell where it's gone to. And, we now hear things like, in the papers last week that the Maroš Šefčovič had seemed to hold out the possibility of the UK joining this Pan-European Mediterranean Convention, which slightly eased rules of origin for some business. And now the EU doesn't particularly think it wants the UK in that, because that'll make it a bit easier for UK exporters. Ditto their absolute refusal to contemplate mutual recognition of conformity assessment, because actually we'd lose some accreditation business to the UK. So there's still a pretty transactional basis for this relationship in the EU outside the defence space. I mean, everything seems to be being calibrated still by, does this mean we'll lose a bit of business to the UK? Oh, yes, it might. Okay, we won't go there yet. So I don't think we're out of the woods on that approach. I think it's really interesting, if the government did decide to put renegotiating EU membership or a much closer relationship with the single market and the customs union onto the agenda, I think there's a really interesting issue about whether the EU would be inclined to respond. Because if you think that there is quite a reasonable chance that the next government may not be a pro-EU government here, do you actually want to go through all that drama again, having, what in the EU's view would be wasted so many years on the British psychodrama of Brexit? I'm not sure that I would want to spend 3 years renegotiating British entry, only then for, Farage, generic Badenoch to turn up and say, sorry, that we don't want to do that at all. I think it's quite interesting, the Conservatives are already committed to reversing any of the agreements that the government does make on SPS and things. I think what the government will be hoping is that actually, selling off Severington and the business and trade bodies saying, actually, this is working much better for us than the position you left us in, will actually create a momentum that there won't be much impetus to undo it if they manage to do it. But I think, so far, whatever. I do think that Rosa is right, though. I mean, Starmer has done quite well, particularly on Trump. I think it's very interesting, though, some of the things he's prepared to say, which do make us look quite unprincipled. I mean, the implicit acknowledgement that Trump has a point on trade when he's tearing up the rules-based trading system, really? The complete failure, you and I, Anand, keep on saying this, nobody else ever does, but the complete failure to register any concern about his territorial ambitions on Canada. I mean, some of these are quite difficult. The bit I have been impressed by, having said how hopeless I think the general comms effort is the discipline they've managed to maintain on ministers going on the Today programme, not reacting to the latest Trump tweet in the way that I think most of them would really want to react. And I do think that has been quite an impressive show from the comms team. Not terribly positive, but I would have regarded every one of those as a potential landmine, and none of those have exploded so far.
I was just thinking how good another Article 50 process after we've rejoined and Nigel Farage became Prime Minister would be for UK in a changing Europe. But anyway, leave that to one side. That might be a little bit selfish. But John, if I can ask you quite quick, because I want to come to Luke quickly and then talk a little bit about the polling more generally.
So look, I think he is. Keir Starmer is very comfortable on the international stage, possibly because he's done campaigning before. He was a lawyer. He campaigned to remove the death penalty in many countries in the Caribbean. So he feels more comfortable at the slower pace of international things where you can consider in advance and it's not driven by the news cycle. I think he's comfortable on the international stage because him and David Lammy and John Healey work together well. And I think that's because David Lammy did develop a doctrine, progressive realism. We'll treat the world as it is. We'll be realistic about it. We'll try and make progress towards social democratic ends when we can, where we can. And that doctrine internationally isn't matched by the doctrine internally, domestically. There's no principle that connects local government reform or welfare reform, health reform or justice reform. There's no commonality of what reform means. I think it shows you doing the intellectual heavy lifting really, really matters. I think on Trump, the danger is we're going to be too close to an irrational man. You have to be close to an elephant because if it rolls over the wrong way, it can endanger your economy. But it is dangerous when you look at other countries. We will come to an election in this country, and in that election, it may not be good for Labour to be so close to Donald Trump and giving so many concessions. To our Commonwealth ally like Canada, we're not going to say you can't be invaded or taken over. And I think it comes to the crunch in. The crass remarks about Israel and Gaza in the election have got a long-term consequence for Labour, and that is that the Iraq War gave the Labour Party Jeremy Corbyn as a leader, and the situation in Gaza is going to give a very different shape to British politics. A party is being formed of left-wingers and pro-Palestinians. That is a major block in British politics now. Foreign policy is coming back. And the terrain in which the 2028-29 general election is going to be fought is one which is formed by the parties to the left of Labour as well as to the party reform to the right of Labour. And the consequence of foreign policy will come back to bite in a major way, in my view.
Oh my God, you've done it again. You've done the perfect segue. Thank you very much indeed, John, because now I want to just turn quickly, Luke, if I can, to the sort of polling in general. You've just released this MRP. I mean, there's loads and loads of questions I could ask you, but I mean, just a couple if you want to sort of outline what the MRP said, and also just consider what John just said, because it's easy to get the impression that number 10 is focused on the challenge from the right, but it's all about the threat from reform. And yet you have movements off on the left that I suspect will prove to be quite important when we come to the local elections next year, and which might be being understated by the Labour Party now. But what do your numbers tell you?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, this is the crux of it. You've got to look at both who you are losing seats to, but that isn't necessarily the same as who you're losing votes to as well. So if you look at the headline of our MRP. We have that Reform would be on 290 seats, Labour on 126, Tories on 80, now remember, I think 81, and the Lib Dems on 73. Big SNP gains in Scotland again. More of those independents that John was talking about making gains as well, and the Greens. Now, look, yeah, these MRP models this far out from election, you can have a big debate about how useful they are. I think they're useful, certainly not for predicting an election, but for looking at where support for different parties is growing and waning. So, initially we saw Reform UK picking up strength in parts of Nottinghamshire and the North East. They've now grown that out into the Welsh Valleys, for instance, starting to make some strides, although not winning seats in Scotland. So it's changed the base of their support. But while Reform are the big winners from Labour's woes, or would be in terms of seats, Labour, in fact, are losing votes across the board. In fact, one of the comparisons I often make is if you look at Labour's vote now, it's starting to look an awful lot like what happened to Boris Johnson's 2019 coalition. You're getting some going to Reform, a few, not many, going back to the Tories, but then you're getting votes going to the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, and also to sort of independent candidates as well. And that is a real challenge for the government. But I think I think there's just been too much of a focus, perhaps, on the voters that they're losing to the right, and they are important as well. But if you, in a seat in what's become known as the Red Wall, lose a chunk of votes to the Liberal Democrats, that matters, because then Reform get in because you've lost votes to your left. And I think we did some polling on how a Corbyn-led left party might perform. Now, bear in mind, this is hypothetical polling, things change, but it showed that the starting point would be they would get around 10% of the vote. They would take the biggest chunk off the Greens, because the Greens have the most progressive voters now, but they'd also take another 3 points off Labour, and that would basically double a Reform lead. And so I agree with John. I think that risk on the left is really important, but I think it feeds into what I started talking about, which are these perceptions of division and chaos. And if I were in government, if they were to listen to my advice, I would be saying between now and recess, you need a series of policies that bring together the Labour family across the piece, stuff that everyone can sort of rally around, because it both deals with the perception of division and means that you're not picking between one flank or another.
Okay. I mean, this has been so interesting that I want to ask you all to put the 7th of July next year in your diaries now at 1 o'clock, so we can do this again 2 years on. And as our starter for 10 next year, I'm going to follow up on your answers to the question I'm about to pose you, which is, given everything we've said, given where we are now, if you had one word of advice for Labour about what they should do now to improve their performance over the next year, so that when you're back in a year's time, you're all as positive as John started off being, what would be your advice to the government now? Jill.
Keir Starmer should strengthen his domestic policy team. He's doing quite well on foreign policy. He's got a good team in place, doesn't really have that on domestic policy. And he needs to get much more interested in economic policy.
Am I right to say they were hiring a senior economic advisor in Number 10 recently?
I think they got rid of some people. I think they are supposed to be doing things, but the domestic policy team is nothing like the sort of big hitters we saw in the Blair policy unit. And for a prime minister who's frankly not very interested in policy, Number 10 needs to be interested in policy and the politics of policy. You can't just leave that all, however wonderful the institution is, to the Treasury.
So in a sense, that goes back to what you were saying about Rachel Reeves being an economist. You need a political input into economic policy from Number 10 that isn't there now. Okay, Rosa.
Yeah, Jill stolen mine because I was going to say exactly that. Be more political. Okay, so I'll add to that communication. I think that when the choices are this difficult, you kind of have to get the public invested in what your project is, and the failure to do that this year has been a big problem. So I think they need to, just talk about the options and explain the choices and try that way to get the public to go along with them.
And actually, there's been quite a few questions in the Slido about whether or not the government is being explicit enough about trade-offs, which I imagine is part of what you're getting at there. John.
So look, I'd say have a story, pick a fight, show who you are, and the best way to do that is to look at Thames Water and say, if you will not abide by UK regulation and you say you're trading insolvent without abiding, and you can't abide by our regulation, we'll buy you. Just use the power of government to fix the thing that people are annoyed with and to pick a fight with capital. Let's have a fight with capital. We're a Labour Party. Let's have a fight with capital.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Luke.
I'm very similar to John. I think they've got to start telling a story, and that doesn't just mean comms. It's partly comms, but it's also about crafting policies which fill the narrative of what is this government for, and in particular, how is it delivering on what people elected it to do.
Is that what we used to call ideology? What you're talking about? Or
I think it might be a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, there's a blast from the past for us all to end with. Listen, we have now officially run out of. My God, I've timed that well. That's so unusual. Thank you all so much. I was being serious about next year. We'll come back and do it after 2 years if you're willing. It would be really interesting. But for the moment, thank you very much. For those I'm not going to see again before the autumn, have a really nice summer as well. And we'll see you soon. Take care.